The woman smiles faintly, eyes strong and unwavering, pulling her hoodie slightly back as if revealing her true power. The manager is blurred in the background, small and defeated. On the surface, it seemed like an ordinary day. The hum of car, engines outside the bustling shopping district, the chatter of people weaving through the sidewalks, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting from a corner cafe painted a picture of routine normalcy. But behind this everyday rhythm was a story waiting to unfold. One that would turn an ordinary shopping trip into a moment that no one inside that store would ever forget. The woman at the center of it all was Aaliyah Carter. To anyone passing by, Aaliyah might have seemed unassuming. That day she wore a plain gray hoodie pulled over her hair, a pair of dark jeans, and comfortable sneakers. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes or flaunting jewelry, and she didn't need to. She had long since outgrown the need to prove herself through appearances. Aaliyah was no stranger to success. In fact, she was the very definition of it. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood, she had built herself up from scratch. Every step she took was marked by determination, sacrifice, and a refusal to be boxed in by the limits others tried to impose on her. Her sharp mind and relentless drive had led her into the world of business, where she climbed higher than anyone expected. By her mid-30s, she was not just successful, she was powerful. What no one in that store realized as she stepped through the doors that morning was that Aaliyah wasn't just a customer. She was the majority shareholder and silent owner of the very retail chain she was about to walk into. She had chosen to stay behind the scenes, never attaching her face to the brand because she wanted the business to stand on its own without her identity overshadowing it. It gave her freedom. It allowed her to test the system, to see how her employees and managers treated the people they served. And today, that test would expose something dark. But let's rewind for just a moment. To understand why this day mattered so much, you need to know who Aaliyah really was, and why her presence in that hoodie carried a weight far heavier than fabric and cotton. Aaliyah grew up in a modest two-bedroom home with her mother and younger brother. Her mother, a nurse who often worked double shifts, taught her the value of resilience and kindness. There were days when they barely scraped by, but there was always dignity in the Carter household. Aaliyah learned early on that the world often judged people not by their worth but by the clothes they wore, the money they carried, and the labels on their backs. She hated that. She promised herself she would one day rise above it and build something that couldn't be taken away from her. Through scholarships, late nights studying, and jobs that demanded every ounce of her strength, she worked her way into college, then into graduate school. She built connections, learned the language of business, and soon realized she had a gift, the ability to see potential where others saw risk. That talent led her into investments, and eventually into buying out struggling companies. She turned failing businesses into thriving enterprises one after the other, until her name carried quiet weight in boardrooms across the country. And yet, despite her wealth, despite her success, Aaliyah never forgot where she came from. She never forgot the sting of being followed through stores as a teenager, the suspicious glances cast her way when she couldn't afford brand-name clothes, or the humiliating assumption that she didn't belong in certain spaces. Those experiences shaped her. They were why, on this day, she deliberately dressed down, choosing comfort over flash. She wanted to blend in with ordinary shoppers. She wanted to remind herself of what it felt like to be judged for appearances alone. The store itself was part of a chain located in an upscale shopping district, a place where polished floors gleamed under bright lights, where mannequins wore the newest fashion, and where the scent of fresh fabric and cologne mingled in the air. It was designed to make people feel important, but it also carried an invisible pressure. You needed to look the part to belong there. For Aaliyah, this wasn't just another location. This was one of her stores. From the moment she stepped inside, she noticed details most customers would miss. The way the shelves were stocked, the placement of displays, even the subtle hum of the air conditioning. These were things she had set standards for in board meetings. She knew what the customer experience was supposed to be. But none of that prepared her for what came next. The store manager on duty that day was Richard Steele, a man in his mid-40s with neatly pressed slacks, a stiff shirt, and the kind of posture that screamed authority. Richard prided himself on being in control of his environment. He wasn't known for kindness or patience. To him, a customer's worth was measured by how much money they looked like they could spend. Designer handbag, respect, business suit, attention, hoodie and sneakers, suspicion. When Richard's eyes fell on Aaliyah, his expression hardened. He didn't see a brilliant entrepreneur or a wealthy investor. He saw only what he wanted to see. A black woman in casual clothes. Someone he instantly labeled as out of place. His assumptions were fast, sharp, and cruel, and they set the stage for what would soon become the most humiliating confrontation of his career. Aaliyah, meanwhile, kept her composure. She moved through the store quietly, browsing racks of clothing with calm interest. She wasn't there to shop, not really. She was observing, watching, testing. She wanted to see how her staff treated an ordinary person who didn't look wealthy. But as Richard continued to track her movements from across the floor, his suspicion grew. To him, her hoodie was more than just clothing. It was a warning sign. And in his mind, he was already preparing to make her feel small, to assert his control over the space. Little did he know, every step she took brought him closer to the most shocking lesson of his life. And so, what began as an ordinary shopping trip, a woman in a hoodie, a store manager with unchecked prejudice, was about to spiral into something far bigger. The tension had been quietly set, like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. The question wasn't if the confrontation would come. The question was how explosive it would be when it finally did. The whispers began almost instantly. Customers who had been casually browsing racks of jeans or comparing prices on handbags suddenly turned their heads, sensing tension in the air. A hoodie, one plain, oversized gray hoodie, had somehow become the focal point of an entire store. And at the center of it all was Aaliyah, standing calm but quietly burning inside, as the store manager tightened his jaw and crossed his arms. At first, it seemed like a misunderstanding. Aaliyah had entered the store quietly, her hood pulled up, her head lowered. She had wanted nothing more than to pick up a few items without being noticed. Anxiety had always shadowed her in public places, and today was no exception. But before, she even had the chance to make her way through the aisles. She noticed the weight of unwanted eyes. Security guards near the entrance shifted. Employees exchanged glances. Shoppers whispered. Then came the first strike. The store manager, a man in his mid-40s with thinning hair and a name tag that read David, store lead, approached her with the sort of stiffness that carried judgment before words were even spoken. His voice was sharp, cold, and loud enough for others to hear. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your hood. We don't allow customers to cover their heads in here. It's suspicious." The word suspicious echoed through the store like a slap. Aaliyah froze. She glanced around, noticing how no one else, not the teenager in a baseball cap, not the older man in a beanie, had been stopped or questioned. It was her hoodie, her skin, her presence that had triggered this hostility. She could have explained herself. She could have told him about her anxiety, about her dislike of being seen, about the way she wore the hoodie like armor. But something inside her kept her still. Calm, observing. "I'm just here to shop," she said softly, but her calm tone only seemed to fuel the manager's growing arrogance. He sneered, stepping closer, raising his voice. "Not dressed like that, you're not. People like you make other shoppers uncomfortable. Either take off the hood or leave." A murmur rippled through the nearby crowd. Some looked down, pretending not to hear. Others watched with wide eyes, sensing the injustice but unwilling to step in. And that was just the beginning. Escalating pressure. Aaliyah tried to continue her shopping, hoping that if she ignored the humiliation, it would pass. But the store manager wasn't done. He followed her through the aisles like a shadow. When she picked up a blouse, he loudly commented, "You can't afford that." When she browsed the jewelry case, he motioned to the clerk and muttered, "Watch her hands." His words were not whispers meant to avoid embarrassment. They were deliberate, loud enough for strangers to hear, sharp enough to sting like open wounds. Each sentence was a dagger, designed not just to discourage her from buying, but to strip her dignity in public. Aaliyah's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about shopping. It was about power. He wanted to make an example out of her, to prove his authority by reducing her to nothing more than a stereotype. And yet, she stayed calm. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Because while the manager thought he was building a case against her, Aaliyah was quietly watching him, testing him, allowing him to reveal who he truly was. By now, the conflict had drawn attention. Shoppers were no longer pretending to browse. They were gathered at the ends of aisles, peeking around displays, phones clutched in their hands, some even recording. A mother whispered to her teenage son, "This is wrong." A college student shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This is messed up." But still, no one stepped in. The manager, feeding on the silence, grew bolder. He gestured at Aaliyah's hoodie and shouted, "If you're not hiding something, why are you dressed like that? This isn't the place for thugs." The word thug hit the air like an explosion. Gasps followed. A young woman near the shoe display put her hand over her mouth. Another shopper whispered, "Did he really just say that?" But the manager stood taller, proud of his cruelty, convinced he was doing the right thing, convinced the store was his domain, and Aaliyah had no place in it. Aaliyah's silence. And through it all, Aaliyah said almost nothing. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She allowed him to speak, to dig deeper, to bury himself in his own arrogance. Every insult, every discriminatory word was fuel. And while outsiders thought she was cornered, Aaliyah knew she was holding all the cards, because hidden beneath her hoodie, beneath her calm, was the truth. She wasn't just another customer. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't without means. She owned more than the manager could ever imagine. The final straw things came to a head when Aaliyah made her way toward the checkout. She had gathered a small collection of items. Nothing extravagant, but enough to make her point. A scarf, a pair of shoes, a handbag. As she placed them on the counter, the cashier glanced nervously at the manager, who had planted himself nearby, arms crossed, watching like a hawk. Then, as the cashier scanned the items, the manager stepped forward and slammed his hand down on the counter. "Stop the sale," he barked. "She's not paying for this. She's stealing." The word hung in the air like poison. Customers gasped. The cashier froze. Aaliyah slowly lifted her gaze, meeting the manager's eyes for the first time. The tension in the store was electric, thick enough to choke on. The accusations had reached their peak. The humiliation was complete, or so the manager thought, because what came next would flip the entire situation upside down, cliffhanger to climax. The crowd leaned closer, some holding up their phones to record. The cashier looked between Aaliyah and the manager, unsure of what to do, and Aaliyah, still calm, still composed, finally let a small smile tug at the corners of her lips. "Are you sure you want to stop this sale?" she asked softly. Her voice carried a weight that no one in the store understood, except her. A voice not of fear, but of quiet power. The manager, thinking he had won, sneered. "Yes, I'm sure." But in that single moment, the balance of power shifted. What the manager didn't know was that Aaliyah wasn't just another shopper. She wasn't someone he could push out of the store. She wasn't even just a wealthy customer. She was the woman who owned the building, who held the lease, who signed the paychecks that kept the lights on. And with a single word, she was about to remind him, and everyone watching, exactly who she was.